Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to be honest with you guys. Usually when we prep for these, I have a general idea of where we're going.
Mm.
We've covered history, we've covered tech psychology, but today I'm looking at this stack of papers you've sent over, and I feel like I'm looking at a complete rewiring of my own brain.
It's a heavy one today. I will admit that right up front.
Heavy is putting it lightly. I mean, usually when we talk about religious texts or historical commentaries, there's a certain vibe, right? It's usually about spirituality or finding inner peace or rituals. But we are looking at a commentary on the Quran today, specifically Surah al-Baqarah, verses 119 to 125. And this isn't the standard Sunday school commentary by any stretch.
No, not at all. We are diving into the work of Allama Ghulam Ahmad Parvez. And his source material here isn't just offering a slightly different opinion on the text. It's effectively arguing that the way most people understand this religion today is just diametrically opposed to what the text actually says.
I mean, that is the core thesis, right? It's not a tweak.
It's a complete inversion.
It feels radical, and I use that word really carefully because reading through these papers, frankly, they look like they could set a bookshelf on fire.
It is radical, but let's actually look at the etymology of that word, because words matter immensely in this deep dive. Radical comes from radix, meaning root. Parvez isn't trying to invent something new here. He's arguing for a return to the root. His whole argument is that over centuries, all these layers of dust and culture, mysticism, hearsay have completely covered the original divine charter, and he wants to scrape all that off.
And that scraping process is really what we're here for today. The mission of this deep dive for you listening is to look at these specific verses, which normally just sound like prophets are good, be a nice person, and see the rational political constitution underneath them. Because we're talking about redefining what a prophet actually does, redefining what worship means, and this is the part that really got me, redefining the very structure of human society.
It moves the text entirely from a book of magic spells to a book of social science. That's the lens we need to wear today. The source material frames this not as theology in the traditional sense, but as a divine charter of liberty.
Liberty. That's a strong word to use for a religious text.
Liberty from mental slavery. Liberty from superstition. Liberty from the tyranny of other human beings. The expert commentary argues that these verses are actually laying out a rational social and political constitution for humanity.
And that's the hook for me. Usually when you think of religious commentaries, you think of, well, spiritual fuzziness. You think of incense and chanting. But here, reading this, I was really surprised by the claim that reading the Quran might not mean what 99% of people actually think it means.
It is the difference between recitation and implementation. And that's the theme we are going to see over and over again today as we unpack this.
So let's give the listener a quick roadmap before we get into the weeds, because the weeds are extremely tall today. We have three main pillars to discuss. First is freedom of choice. This is the idea that a messenger or a prophet is a guide and not a dictator.
Right. And the second pillar is the anti-sectarian mandate. This is probably the most explosive part of the source material. The claim is that sectarianism, so splitting into religious groups, is actually equivalent to shirk or polytheism.
That is a wild claim. We are definitely going to spend some time unpacking that because I know a lot of people are going to scratch their heads at that one. And the third pillar is redefining rituals. We're going to look at the story of Abraham or Ibrahim, not just as a religious figure doing religious things, but as a model of rational leadership.
It's a complete paradigm shift, for sure.
So shall we just jump right into the role of the messenger?
Let's do it.
Okay, so we are looking at verses 119 and 120. The source material starts by analyzing the prophet's role. Now, traditionally, you hear two Arabic terms thrown around a lot here, Bashir and Nazir. And if I just look at a standard off-the-shelf translation, Bashir is translated as giver of glad tidings, and Nazir is warner. It sounds very, I don't know, transactional to me. Do good, get a cookie, do bad, get a timeout.
Exactly.
But the source material spends a lot of time dissecting these two roles. Why does it do that? What's wrong with the cookie and timeout definition?
Because Parvez argues that those translations totally strip away the functional nature of the words. He looks at them as laws of cause and effect instead. Think of Bashir not as a guy standing there handing out rewards, but as an analyst.
An analyst, like a data analyst.
In a sense, yes. Or maybe a structural engineer is a better way to look at it. A Bashir is someone who understands the machinery of the universe, specifically the social machinery. He looks at a society that aligns with natural laws like truth, justice, equity, and he predicts the outcome of that alignment. He says, if you build your society on these solid pillars, the result will be pleasant. That pleasant result is the glad tiding.
Ah, I see.
It's a forecast. It's not a prize he just keeps in his pocket to hand out to his favorites.
So it's scientific. It's like the engineer saying if you use reinforced steel, the bridge is going to hold your weight.
Exactly. And Nazir is just the opposite side of that same coin. It's the safety inspector saying, if you build this bridge out of wet cardboard, it will collapse. The collapse isn't a punishment from the inspector, right? It's the inevitable consequence of the structural flaw.
So he isn't threatening them at all. He's just informing them of how reality works.
Precisely. He strips away that whole supernatural aura of a divine curse and looks at the highly functional role of a messenger. The messenger comes with universal truths. His job is strictly to analyze the paths humanity is taking and report on where it leads.
That perfectly brings us to the signpost analogy, which I found incredibly helpful when I was reading the text. It's so simple, but it really clarifies the limits of divine authority. The text says the prophet is essentially like a signpost standing at a crossroads.
Yes, this is a crucial philosophical point in Parwez's work. Imagine you are driving a car. You come to a fork in the road, and there is a signpost right there in the middle. One arrow points to Model Town, a place of order, beauty, safety, prosperity. The other arrow points to the desert, a place of utter chaos, thirst, and death.
I have the visual.
The signpost's job is purely to provide that clear information. It tells you unambiguously, left is Model Town, right is desert. It has to be accurate. It has to be visible to everyone.
And this is the kicker. The signpost cannot physically jump inside your car and grab the steering wheel for you.
Exactly right. The source emphasizes that the divine philosophy of freedom explicitly prohibits coercion. God does not force guidance upon individuals. Parwez argues fundamentally that coerced goodness is not goodness.
I really want to drill into that. Coerced goodness is not goodness. Because I think a lot of people would intuitively say, well, if I force someone to stop stealing, isn't that a net good for society?
Is it, though? If I put a gun to your head and force you to donate your wallet to a charity, have you actually done a good deed?
I guess the charity got the money. But I didn't do anything moral. I just really didn't want to get shot.
Correct. You earn zero credit for that. Your character hasn't developed or changed at all. You're just a victim of superior force. The source argues that the moral value of any human action depends entirely on the freedom to choose it. If the prophet were to magically force people onto the right path, the entire test of human existence would be completely nullified. We would just be robots.
Or a herd of sheep. And the source heavily implies that the Quran wants to create men of will, not a herd of sheep.
Exactly. Autonomy is the point.
But there is a massive flip side to this freedom, right? The source talks about the law of requital, and this is where the driving analogy gets a little scary for me.
Yes, this is where the signpost analogy gets much deeper. You are completely free to choose the path. You can firmly turn the wheel towards the desert. No one is going to stop you. The signpost definitely won't physically block your car. But once you have chosen that path, you are not free to choose the destination.
I see. So I can't drive into the scorching desert and then angrily demand to arrive in a lush garden.
Exactly. The source explicitly states that if you take the road to the desert, you cannot demand to arrive at the garden. The consequences are fundamentally built into the choice itself. This is the law of requital. You choose the action, and the action chooses the outcome. You are completely free to jump off a 10-story building, but you are not free to decide whether gravity applies to you halfway down.
Wow. Yeah, that makes it very stark. And this leads to a very human moment in the source material, which I wasn't expecting. It discusses the prophet's own emotional state regarding this. Because if you're the signpost and the desert leads to death, and you have to just stand there and watch people driving there, that's going to be absolutely heartbreaking.
It is deeply heartbreaking. The text describes the prophet effectively stressing himself out, consuming himself with profound grief, because the people he cared about were willfully choosing the wrong path.
It's a very touching analysis. It shows the prophet's deep empathy. He sees his own people heading toward a cliff, heading toward social and moral destruction, and he is just desperate to stop them.
But the verses come down as a divine reassurance to him. God is effectively comforting him here.
It's almost like a cosmic, it's not your fault, man.
Essentially, yes. The source highlights verses where God tells the prophet, your job is delivery, not enforcement. There is a specific reference to the idea that you cannot guide those you love simply because you love them. Guidance follows a universal law. If someone actively wants to be guided, the law helps them. If they don't even live, a prophet of God cannot force them.
That's a really powerful lesson in modern leadership, or even parenting, honestly. You can teach them, you can model good behavior, you can put up all the right signposts, but you cannot live someone else's life for them.
And the source argues that this freedom of choice is the absolute foundational value of the deen, which is the system of life presented in the text. It's not about blind obedience to a master. It's about a conscious, rational alignment with a universal law.
So we have firmly established that the messenger is a guide, not a warden. Now let's move to the second pillar, because this is where the source material really starts throwing punches. We need to talk about the pathology of sectarianism.
This section is derived from Parwiz's commentary on verses 120 and 121. The source sets the historical scene by describing the Jews and Christians of that specific era. They were completely locked in a group identity mentality.
The classic my team mentality.
Exactly. They were effectively saying, you must join our specific group to be saved. It wasn't about your universal values or your moral conduct. It was entirely about the label. Be a Jew and you are saved. Be a Christian and you are saved.
So it's basically ancient identity politics.
Pure identity politics. It's not what did you do for humanity, it's what jersey are you wearing today.
And the source draws a direct, bright red line from those ancient groups straight to modern Muslims' right.
It does, without hesitation. Parwez explicitly compares this ancient tribalism to modern sectarianism within Islam. He describes the exact same mindset, I am right and everyone else is going to hell.
This brings us to the 73 sects narrative, which is fascinating. I think many of our listeners who study this space might have heard this. The tradition that the religious community will eventually split into 73 sects and only one of them will go to heaven.
Right, and typically that tradition is taught as a dark prophecy. Like, this will happen, so prepare for it. Or even worse, as a bizarre badge of honor where people desperately try to figure out which specific group is the saved sect.
Right, because everyone naturally assumes their group is the one.
The source is extremely critical of this entire tradition. Parwez argues that this narrative historically created a deeply toxic psychology of self-righteousness. Because if you genuinely believe that only one group out of 73 is saved and you happen to be born into a group, you must fiercely convince yourself that you are the chosen ones.
Because the terrifying alternative is that you're just accidentally in one of the 72 hell-bound groups.
Precisely. So instead of seeking objective truth, I have to spend all my mental energy proving everyone else is wrong to protect my own salvation. The source argues that this belief system is exactly what cements societal division. Instead of trying to unify humanity, everyone is just trying to prove they hold the golden ticket.
But the source goes way further than just calling sectarianism bad or toxic. It calls it shirk.
Yes, this is the theological bombshell of the whole paper.
Well, hold on. I really need to pause you there to make sure I get this right. Shirk is the big one. That's the unforgivable sin. Usually that means bowing down to a stone idol or worshiping a literal statue of Zeus or something. Are you telling me the source actually equates joining a specific school of thought, like identifying as a Hanafi or Maliki or a Shia, with worshiping a statue of Zeus?
That is exactly the argument he is making. But you really have to follow his precise logic on the concept of authority to get there.
Walk me through it. How on earth is a theological sect the exact same thing as a physical idol?
The logic flows like this. God's law, the divine constitution, is one. It is unified, and it is contradiction-free. When you create a sect, you are essentially choosing to follow the specific opinions of human leaders, scholars, imams, historical figures over or alongside that unified divine law.
I'm with you so far.
So, if divine law clearly says do X, but your specific sect leader says actually for our group, we do Y and you choose to do Y, who have you actually obeyed?
Well, you've obeyed the leader.
Exactly. You have prioritized a flawed human opinion over the universal divine law. In doing so, you have elevated a human being to the status of a divine lawgiver. You have quite literally set up a partner with God in the specific domain of authority and sovereignty. That, according to Parwez, is political shirk. It's not about bowing to statues at all. It's about who holds ultimate sovereignty.
Wow. So by aggressively saying, I follow Scholar X's interpretation to the exclusion of all others, you are essentially creating a mini-god out of Scholar X?
In a functional societal sense, yes, absolutely. You are giving human opinion the absolute weight of divine law. And the source cites specific verses stating that the prophet has absolutely no connection with those who divide their religion into sects. It literally says he washes his hands of them completely.
That is such a stark contrast to the way people usually operate. Usually people think I love the prophet so much because I am a fiercely devoted member of this specific traditional group.
And the source says the exact opposite is true. If you are deeply entrenched in a specific group that by definition excludes other human beings, you have completely severed your tie with the prophet's actual mission, because his mission was to bring a unified constitution for all of humanity, not to start a private club.
The source also mentions a very specific behavioral symptom of the sectarianism, which is anger.
Yes, the emotionalism versus reason debate. Parwes notes the sectarian belief is almost entirely based on emotion and inherited identity, not intellect. That's why when you calmly question a sectarian's dogma with actual textual evidence, they don't usually say, let me look at that data.
No, they usually start shouting or calling you a heretic.
They get violent. They get incredibly angry.
Because you're not just attacking an abstract idea, you're attacking their core identity and their safety blanket.
Exactly. Their belief is an emotional safety blanket. The source contrasts this volatile state with the man of reason or the rational believer. The rational believer actively welcomes evidence. If you prove a rational believer wrong, they are actually happy because you just help them move one step closer to the actual truth.
It's the difference between a scientist and a hardcore sports fan. If a scientist finds out their long-held theory is wrong, they might be annoyed for a day, but ultimately they adapt and maybe win a Nobel Prize for finding the real truth. If a sports fan hears that their team sucks and sees the stats proving it, they just start a riot in the parking lot.
That is a perfect analogy for what Parwes is describing. And the source material demands that society move away from the sports fan mentality and adopt the scientist mentality regarding the Quran.
Which serves as a really perfect segue to our third section today, redefining tilawat. Because if we aren't supposed to be sectarian sports fans waving our team flags, what exactly are we supposed to be doing with this book?
This is where we get into the heavy linguistics of the text. And this is another one of those complete rewiring moments you mentioned at the start.
So, tilawat. If you go to literally any Muslim community around the world today, tilawat means reciting the Quran out loud. Usually in Arabic, usually with a really beautiful, specific melody. And the belief is you get spiritual points thawab for every single letter you pronounce.
The source material challenges this definition incredibly aggressively. It argues that the Arabic root of the word tilawat, T-L-O-W, does not actually mean to read at all. The specific Arabic word for read is qara. Tilawat means something very different. It means to follow closely or to walk directly behind someone.
Like a shadow following a person walking down the street.
Exactly. Or the way the moon follows the sun across the sky. It heavily implies active physical pursuit and adherence. It implies that the leading entity moves forward and you move forward with it. By definition, you cannot do tilawat sitting completely still in a comfortable chair.
The source uses a couple of analogies here that I just thought were brilliant for explaining this. First is the doctor's prescription.
Yes. Parwes imagines a scenario where you are deathly ill with a terrible disease. You go to a top specialist. He carefully writes out a prescription for a very specific life-saving medicine. You take that piece of paper and you just read it. You recite it beautifully. You wrap it in expensive silk and put it on a high shelf to show it respect. You read the ingredients out loud 1,000 times a day. You even hire a professional singer to sing the prescription to you in a beautiful voice.
But you never actually go to the pharmacy, buy the medicine, and put it in your body.
You never swallow the actual pill. So a month later, you're dying in your bed, and you look up at the ceiling and cry out, God, why am I dying? I treated this prescription with such immense respect. I recited it 1,000 times every morning.
It sounds totally ridiculous when you put it in a real-world context like that.
It is entirely ridiculous. But the source vigorously argues that this is the exact current state of the nations that claim to follow the Quran today. They are beautifully chanting the prescription while actively dying of the disease it was meant to cure.
And the disease in this context is that societal decline, that complete lack of unity and justice we talked about earlier.
Yes. The text is the cure, but only if swallowed. The other powerful analogy he uses is the map.
Right, rubbing your fingers over the map. I love this one.
Imagine you desperately want to travel to Model Town. You have a highly detailed map showing you exactly how to get there. Every single morning, you wake up and you lovingly run your fingers over the correct route on the map. You kiss the map. You memorize the names of the streets. But you never actually open your front door and step outside to walk the path. Will you ever reach Model Town?
No. You'll just end up with a really worn-out map and you'll still be sitting in your living room.
The source is absolutely scathing about what it calls the 900,000 recitations culture. It mentions historical anecdotes of people proudly claiming to recite the entire Quran hundreds of thousands of times in their life, or stories of famous saints who were so fast they could finish the whole Quran while mounting a horse like one foot goes in the stirrup, they start reciting, and by the time the other foot swings over the saddle, they've finished the entire book.
Like a literal magic trick.
And the source does not treat these stories as beautiful miracles of faith, it treats them as well as dangerous absurdities.
It flat out calls itself deception.
Yes. It asks the very logical question, is this text a magic spell? Because if it's a comprehensive book of societal guidance, reading the whole thing in 30 seconds is completely meaningless. You cannot possibly comprehend a complex constitution or a deep political philosophy in 30 seconds while jumping on a horse.
It's basically treating the text like a fidget spinner, just something mindless to do with your tongue while your actual brain is completely disengaged.
That is harsh, but that's exactly the source's point. It passionately argues that despite being arguably the most recited book in the history of the world, the nations currently following it are in utter ruin because they chant the words instead of implementing the laws.
So if chanting is out, what is true tilawat according to Parwaz?
True tilawat is the incredibly difficult active work of making the divine law the sovereign supreme authority in a living society. It means meticulously checking every single decision, political, social, economic, against the signpost. The source argues that this active implementation is the one and only way to actually kill sectarianism.
Walk me through that. Why is implementing a law the only way to kill sex?
Because human opinions inherently differ and always will.
Yeah.
If society decides to follow Imam A's opinion or Imam B's opinion, we will inevitably fight because those opinions clash. But a universal law is singular. If the objective law is the recognized authority, the fighting has to stop. It's exactly like traffic rules. We don't violently fight in the streets about which side of the road to drive on because the established law is clear and enforced.
Right.
If we all suddenly decided to drive based on our own personal spiritual interpretation of the road, we'd have absolute chaos and mass casualties.
That makes perfect logical sense. So we move from the abstract concept of tilawat to the actual physical embodiment of it, because you really can't talk about strictly following the law without talking about the ultimate historical model of this rational anti-sectarian leadership, Abraham.
Yes. And the text goes out of its way to introduce him not just as a prophet who lived a long time ago, but as the Uswa Hasana, which translates to the excellent model for all time.
Now, normally when people talk about Abraham in a religious context, they talk almost exclusively about the miracles. They talk about the massive fire miraculously becoming cool. They talk about the dramatic sacrifice of his son. It's all framed as very mystical and supernatural.
But Parwaz's source material focuses entirely on his logic and his political rebellion. Parwaz argues that Abraham stood completely alone against the establishment of his time. And to understand the weight of that, we really need to understand what the establishment actually meant back in ancient Babylon.
Right, it wasn't just a local church he was disagreeing with.
No, it was a massive, impenetrable nexus of the head priest and the king. The source describes Abraham's father Azar not just as a stubborn dad who liked statues, but as the actual chief priest of the national temple. This was a position of immense political and economic power. The high priest was the one who legitimized the king's rule to the masses.
So by openly challenging his father's religious practices, Abraham wasn't just having a tense domestic dispute at the dinner table, he was functionally committing state treason.
Exactly. He was directly challenging the state religion and, by extension, the entire political and economic structure of the empire. And the crucial point is, he didn't do it with magic tricks. He did it with pure, observable logic.
The star worship argument is the classic example the text brings up here.
Right. The source retells the famous story of Abraham looking up at the stars, the moon, and the sun. His people literally worshiped these celestial bodies as powerful deities. Abraham looks at them, observes their movements, and says, these things set. They disappear. They're clearly subject to rigid laws of motion. A true God cannot be subject to laws. A true God must be the supreme creator of those laws.
I do not love things that set. That's the famous poetic line.
It's a brilliant declaration of intellectual independence. He is looking at the highest powers his society recognizes and saying, I will not bow to something that has obvious physical limitations.
And then he takes this philosophical debate directly to the top, to the king Nimrod.
This is the ultimate political showdown. Nimrod arrogantly claims to be the supreme giver of life and death. He argues to Abraham, I can take a prisoner and execute him, or I can choose to set him free. See, I control life and death. I am God.
Which honestly is just a cheap lawyer's trick. That's not creating life. That's just deferring a murder.
Exactly. And Abraham doesn't even bother getting bogged down in the messy metaphysics of executions and pardons. He immediately shifts the battleground to the undeniable laws of nature. He looks at the king and says, my God brings the sun from the east every morning. You bring it from the west.
Total checkmate.
Absolute public checkmate. The source heavily emphasizes here that true faith is built on intellect and observable physical facts. Abraham actively uses the visible mechanical universe to logically prove the existence of a higher power. It's not about closing your eyes and blindly believing what the priest tells you. It's about opening your eyes wide and analyzing reality.
Now we get to a part of the source material that is undeniably sarcastic. And I really enjoyed reading this part, even though the underlying point is very serious. It's about the trials of Abraham.
Oh yes, the Quran explicitly mentions that Abraham was deeply tested with certain immense commands, and because he fulfilled them perfectly, he was elevated and made a leader or an imam for all mankind.
And the expert commentary spends time looking at how traditional scholars have interpreted these great tests.
Yes, Parwez references classical commentaries like Ibn Kathir, which seriously suggest that these great trials that elevated him to global leadership were things like clipping his nails, circumcision, trimming his mustache, and plucking underarm hair.
Wait, really? The great trials that made him the ultimate leader of humanity were basically just personal hygiene routines.
That is exactly what the traditional historical commentaries often explicitly list. And Parwez is just absolutely savage about this in his writing. He essentially asks, is this really why he was made Imam of all mankind? For keeping his mustache neat?
When you put it that way, it does seem a bit wildly disproportionate. You don't become the George Washington or the Nelson Mandela of human history just because you remember to floss regularly.
Exactly. The source argues that this bizarre interpretation completely trivializes the immense real-world struggle of the prophet. Parwez lists what the actual real trials were based on the text: standing completely alone against the chief priest who was his own father, being violently expelled from his childhood home and his nation, standing face to face before a tyrant king, and ultimately walking into the fire, which the source hints quite strongly could be a metaphor for the intense consuming political opposition and danger he faced.
The fire of total social ostracization and political persecution.
Yes. Imagine for a second standing completely alone against the entire known world, your own family, your absolute king, your entire society, and calmly saying you are all entirely wrong and I am right. That is the actual trial. The trial was simply, will you ever compromise on the absolute truth when your life is on the line? And he didn't. That immense character strength is exactly why he was made imam, not because of his grooming habits.
That feels so much more substantial and worthy of the title. It firmly connects divine leadership to unshakable moral character, not to empty physical ritual.
Yeah, and that logical thread leads directly to the very next question Abraham asks immediately after getting the job of imam. He asks God, does this leadership promise apply automatically to my children?
Basically asking, can I get a family discount on this whole leadership thing?
Essentially, yes. He wants to know if this new system is going to be a standard hereditary monarchy like every other kingdom on earth. And the divine veto comes down instantly and firmly: my covenant does not reach the wrongdoers or the Zalimin.
This is the ultimate meritocracy versus lineage point.
It is a massive, fatal blow to the entire human concept of holy bloodlines. The source argues relentlessly that leadership and divine salvation are not things you can inherit. Being the literal biological son of a grand prophet means absolutely nothing on its own. Zero. Without your own personal moral character, your noble lineage is totally void. The source sharply contrasts this ancient meritocratic standard with the modern cultural mindset, where people genuinely think just having the holy book sitting on a shelf in their house or simply being born into a Muslim family automatically makes them incredibly special and saved. The text says very clearly, no, you have to actually earn it through your own actions.
This directly brings us to the final physical symbol of this whole unified system, the Kaaba.
The house.
The source really emphasizes that the Kaaba wasn't actually built just for Muslims to use.
That is a point that totally catches people off guard when they first read this. The original verse clearly says the house was built for al-Nas, which translates to all mankind.
A completely universal center.
Yes. Parwez interprets the actual physical structure of the Kaaba as a lasting monument and symbol of a unified human brotherhood. It's functionally supposed to be the central physical location where the United Nations of this divine system actually meets to govern.
And here we have another really cool linguistic gem from the text. The word imam, which we usually just think of as the guy standing at the front leading the local prayer. But the source connects the root of that word to a mason's tool.
The plumb line. In masonry and construction, a plumb line is a simple string with a heavy weight tied at the end. You hold it up against a brick wall you are building to see objectively if the wall is perfectly straight or if it's leaning dangerously to one side.
So the imam in this context is the objective standard of straightness.
Yes. The Kaaba and the divine guidance it represents act together as the ultimate plumb line for all of humanity. They exist purely to keep the wall of humanity rising perfectly straight. If the societal wall starts to tilt, say it tilts into violent sectarianism or into cruel tyranny or into massive economic inequality, the plumb line instantly reveals that error so it can be corrected.
It prevents the entire societal building from just collapsing on everyone.
Exactly. And the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to this house, is described in Parwaz's source not as a mystical ritual walk, but as a literal annual global conference.
A global conference to actually do what, though?
To physically witness the tangible benefits of living under this unified system. The source argues that Hajj was originally meant to be the specific time and place where actual elected representatives of all nations gathered together to collaboratively solve major human problems, to engage in fair trade, to freely exchange ideas, and to publicly reaffirm their shared commitment to the one universal law.
And the source bitterly laments that it has sadly become just
A completely hollow ritual. Millions of people go, they push, they shut, they spin around the building a few times, and they just come home. The entire conference aspect, the actual solving of real-world economic and political problems, is completely gone.
So if we just zoom all the way out here, we are seeing a truly massive paradigm shift in how to read this text. We started with a signpost that merely gives you a clear choice but doesn't force you. We moved through the extreme theological danger of splitting into sectarian teams. We completely redefined the act of reading as actively following a law. We looked at Abraham as a brave political rebel against state tyranny, not just a guy who invented a new hygiene routine. And we ended with this grand vision of a literal United Nations operating under a single divine law.
That is an excellent summary of a very dense text. It really is a complete intellectual journey from blind, mindless ritual to active societal implementation, moving from pure emotional dogmatic belief to hard, rational conviction.
And the source makes a really bold, sweeping claim right at the very end. It strongly suggests that the current global state of decline in these nations, the deep poverty, the endless infight, the total lack of actual geopolitical power, is directly and solely due to this exact shift in understanding.
Yes. The final assertion is that you simply cannot successfully run a modern state or build a thriving civilization on invisible spiritual thawab points. You desperately need a solid working constitution. You need an enforceable system. The source forcefully argues that the Quran originally was and still is that exact constitution, but the people over centuries have comically turned it into a book of magic chants. And as Parwaz points out, you cannot build a working spaceship or a just thriving society using magic chants.
That is exactly the final provocative thought we want to leave you with today. If you take a brilliant, life-saving constitution and you treat it exclusively like a mystical prayer book, do you inevitably lose all the real-world rights, protections, and success that constitution was meant to offer you?
It seems the source material answers that question with a very loud and very historically observable yes.
So here is our final challenge to you, the listener. The next time you encounter a signpost in your life, whether that's a specific verse you read, a piece of profound advice you hear, or a tough moral choice you have to make, stop and honestly ask yourself, are you actually sitting in the driver's seat driving the car toward the destination?
Or are you just standing out there in the desert polishing the sign?
Oh, that's really good. Are you just polishing the sign? I like that a lot. We're going to officially leave it right there. This has been a deeply fascinating dive into the rationalist commentary of Allama Parwaz. It's incredibly heavy stuff. It really pushes against the grain, but it forces you to actually think. And ultimately, that's exactly what we are here for.
Absolutely. Rigorous critical thinking is really the only way forward for us.
Thanks so much for listening and exploring this with us. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Good eye.